They threw her out into a blizzard on Christmas Eve, with nothing but her 6-year-old daughter and a ring of rusted keys they claimed were worthless. To the wealthy Harrison family, it was the perfect cruelty. Handing a grieving widow the keys to a storage unit full of old cardboard boxes instead of giving her a home. They laughed as they watched her drive away into the storm, convinced she was finished. But arrogance has a way of blinding people to the truth. Because they made a fatal mistake that day. They didn't check what was inside the boxes. They didn't know that the garbage they mocked was actually a carefully calculated fortune hidden in plain sight by a husband who knew exactly how greedy his family truly was. And by the time they realized what those rusted keys actually opened, it was already too late to stop her from taking everything back. The wind didn't just blow through the streets of Oak Creek that afternoon. It screamed, tearing through the skeletal branches of the maples and driving sheets of ice against the windows of the lawyer's office. Inside, the air was stiflingly warm, smelling of lemon polish and the stale, suffocating scent of expensive leather. But Sarah couldn't feel the heat. She sat on the edge of the high-backed chair, her body rigid, a posture learned from years of walking on eggshells. Beside her, 6-year-old Mia was drawing circles on her fogged-up glasses with a thumb that looked too small, too fragile. Sarah pulled the girl closer, wrapping the edge of her own threadbare coat over Mia's knees. It was a reflex, a biological imperative that overrode the numbness spreading through her own chest. Mark had been in the ground for less than 3 hours, the dirt still loose and wet on his grave. And yet, here they were, the grieving widow and the vultures. Across the mahogany desk, the Harrisons sat like a tribunal. Eleanor, her mother-in-law, picked at a piece of lint on her black cashmere lapel, her face a mask of dry, preserved grief that looked more like annoyance than sorrow. Next to her sat Derek, Mark's older brother, checking his watch. He smelled of cologne and arrogance, the kind of man who viewed a funeral as a scheduling conflict. "Let's skip the preamble, Mr. Henderson," Derek said, his voice smooth, cutting through the silence. "We all have places to be, especially with this storm getting worse." The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling papers that sounded like dried leaves. He wouldn't look Sarah in the eye. That was the first sign that the floor was about to drop out from under her. "As you know, Sarah," the lawyer began, his tone practiced and apologetic. "Mark's financial situation was complex. The medical bills from the last 2 years were substantial. He leveraged the house against the business loans." Sarah felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. "He told me the insurance covered it. He said the house was safe." "He lied," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the sharpness of breaking glass. She finally looked at Sarah, her eyes devoid of any maternal warmth. "He always did have a romantic relationship with the truth, didn't he? Just like he had a romantic notion that marrying a waitress would somehow work out." Sarah tightened her grip on Mia's shoulder. Mia looked up, sensing the shift in the air, her wide eyes darting between the adults. "The bank owns the house, Sarah," Derek interjected, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the polished wood. "Technically, they've owned it for 6 months. We bought the debt to keep the Harrison name out of the foreclosure listings in the Sunday paper. We did it for the family reputation, not for you." "So," Sarah's voice trembled, and she hated herself for it. "So we have to move? When?" "Tonight," Derek said flatly. The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Outside, the blizzard battered the glass, a white wall of fury. "You can't be serious," Sarah whispered, the panic finally rising into her throat. "It's 2 days before Christmas. There is a blizzard. I have a 6-year-old child. Mark was your son, Eleanor. Mia is your granddaughter. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her skirt. The movement was final. Mark made his choices. And Mia, well, she is your responsibility now. We've been generous enough covering the funeral costs. We are putting the house on the market tomorrow morning. The staging crew arrives at 8. Derek reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a checkbook. He didn't pull out an envelope of cash to help them get through the week. Instead, he produced a heavy, jagged ring of keys. They weren't house keys. They were small, rusted, and looked like they belonged to a dungeon. He tossed them across the desk. They slid over the mahogany and came to a stop right in front of Sarah's hands. The metal made a dull, heavy sound that seemed to echo in the silent room. Mark did leave you something, though, Derek said, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Specific instructions in the addendum. He wanted you to have the contents of Unit 404 at the U-Store IT facility out on the highway. Sarah stared at the rusted keys. It's a storage unit. Derek laughed, a dry, humorless sound. We checked the inventory list. Old comic books, broken toys, boxes of junk he refused to throw away since college. We were going to burn it. But he insisted it was his legacy for you. He made air quotes with his fingers, his eyes dancing with mockery. Consider it your severance package. There might be enough scrap metal in there to buy a bus ticket out of town. Eleanor was already putting on her leather gloves. Come, Derek, the roads are getting bad. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't look at Mia. They simply turned and walked out of the office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind them, leaving a silence that was louder than the storm outside. Sarah sat frozen. The humiliation burned her cheeks, hot and stinging. She looked at the rusted keys, then at the window where the snow was burying the world in white. She had $40 in her checking account. The heater in her 10-year-old sedan was broken, and she had nowhere to go. Mommy, Mia whispered, tugging on Sarah's sleeve. Are we going home now? I'm cold. Sarah looked down at her daughter. The fear in Mia's eyes was a mirror of her own, and that terrified her more than the Harrisons ever could. She couldn't crumble. Not now. If she broke, Mia would freeze. It was a primal switch that flipped deep in her brain, the same instinct that made a wolf bare its teeth when cornered. She reached out and grabbed the cold, rusted keys. They bit into her palm, sharp and unforgiving. No, baby, Sarah said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, hollow but steady. We're going on an adventure. Daddy left us a treasure map. She stood up, buttoning her coat with trembling fingers, and led her daughter out into the biting wind, clutching the keys to a box of trash that was supposed to be their salvation. The sedan was a dying animal, coughing and shuddering as it crawled along the highway's shoulder. The heater had given up miles ago, leaving the interior of the car almost as frigid as the air outside. Sarah gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, her eyes straining to see through the windshield where the wipers were losing their battle against the driving snow. Beside her, Mia had stopped asking questions. She had curled into a tight ball in the passenger's seat, her small head resting against the cold window, watching the suburban lights fade into the darkness of the industrial district. This was the part of town where the plows didn't go first, a landscape of chain-link fences, empty warehouses, and shadows. They found the place by the flickering neon of its sign. You store it. The S and T were burnt out, leaving the sign to read, You or it, a nonsensical beacon in the storm. Sarah parked the car in front of the long, corrugated metal row marked with the numbers 400-450. The wind howled across the asphalt, picking up loose grit and ice and flinging it against her face as she stepped out. She fumbled with the rusted keys Derek had thrown at her fingers numb and clumsy. Unit 404. It took her 3 tries to get the key to turn in the padlock. The metal was frozen. When the lock finally clicked, she grabbed the handle of the roll-up door and heaved. It resisted, groaning with the screech of metal on metal that sounded like a scream in the quiet night, before finally rattling upward. The smell hit her first. It wasn't the smell of rotting garbage, but it was the smell of stagnation. Dust, old paper, mildew, and time. Sarah pulled a small flashlight from her coat pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a chaotic mountain of cardboard. It was floor-to-ceiling junk. There were stacks of yellowed newspapers, boxes overflowing with what looked like children's toys, crates of books with spine cracks and tangled wires. It looked like the inside of a hoarder's mind. It looked like carelessness. "Is this Daddy's office?" Mia asked. She was standing just behind Sarah's leg, shivering violently. Sarah felt a surge of anger so potent it almost warmed her blood. This was it. This was the legacy. While she had been waitressing double shifts to pay for his treatments, while she had been budgeting for groceries down to the penny, Mark had been renting a metal box to store comic books, plastic figures. "No, sweetie," Sarah said, forcing the bitterness down. This is Daddy's secret hideout." They couldn't stay in the car. The engine was overheating and the gas was low. This metal box was their only shelter. Sarah moved 2 heavy boxes aside, clearing a small square of concrete floor near the back, away from the draft of the door. She retrieved the emergency blankets from the trunk of the car, thin, scratchy wool things she'd kept for roadside breakdowns, and fashioned a nest. Dinner was a packet of peanut butter crackers she found in her purse and a half-frozen bottle of water. They sat on the concrete, the flashlight casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of boxes. Mia took a small bite of a cracker, chewing slowly. She looked around at the towering stacks of cardboard. "Mommy?" "Yeah, baby. How is Santa going to find us here?" Mia's voice was small, trembling on the edge of tears. "We don't have a chimney, and he doesn't have the key number." Sarah felt her heart fracture. She pulled Mia into her lap, wrapping her coat around the girl, trying to share whatever body heat she had left. "Santa is magic, Mia," she lied, her voice thick. "He has a master key that opens every door in the world, even big metal ones. He knows exactly where we are. He's probably watching us on his GPS right now." Mia seemed to accept this, or maybe she was just too tired to argue. Within minutes, the exhaustion of the day took over, and her breathing evened out into a sleep that was too heavy, too still. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat with her back against a stack of crates, listening to the wind batter the metal door. The cold seeped through the concrete floor, settling into her bones. She stared at the box directly across from her. It was open at the top, revealing a stack of colorful magazines. Comic books with garish covers of men in spandex fighting monsters. She reached out and picked one up. The paper felt brittle. The covers showed a Spider-Man figure. The colors faded and dull. The amazing Spider-Man. It looked old. It looked worthless. "Damn you, Mark," she whispered into the darkness, the tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. "You left us nothing. You left us trash." She wanted to tear the book in half. She wanted to scream until her throat bled. But she just let the comic book drop from her hand onto the dusty floor. She pulled Mia tighter, closing her eyes against the reality of their life. Morning came not with sunlight, but with a gray, diffused gloom. Sarah woke with a start. Her neck was stiff, her legs cramping. But what woke her was the heat, not the air. "Mia." Sarah put a hand to her daughter's forehead. It was burning. Mia moaned in her sleep. Her cheeks flushed a dangerous red. The cold had done its work. Panic, sharp and immediate, cut through the fog of Sarah's exhaustion. She checked her wallet. $12 cash. The checking account was overdrawn from the funeral deposit. She needed medicine. She needed warm food. She needed a motel room for tonight, or Mia wouldn't make it. She looked around the unit wildly. There had to be something here. Anything. A tool set, a piece of copper wire, anything she could pawn. She grabbed the box of comic books she had cursed the night before. It was heavy. She grabbed another box that rattled with plastic. Old action figures still in their packaging, collecting dust. "Okay," she breathed, hoisting the box of comics. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. "Okay. Let's see what your junk is worth, Mark." She woke Mia gently, helping the groggy, feverish child to the car. Then she loaded 3 boxes of the trash into the back seat. She didn't know where to go, but she remembered seeing a pawn shop sign near the highway exit. An old place with bars on the windows and a sign that said, "We buy anything." It was a long shot. It was a desperate shot. But as she pulled the metal door down and locked the darkness back inside, Sarah knew it was the only shot she had. The bell above the door of Jacobs & Sons Antiques announced Sarah's arrival, a delicate chime that seemed too cheerful for the heaviness in her chest. The shop was a narrow, clutter-filled tunnel of history, smelling of old varnish, silver polish, and the distinct dry scent of time standing still. Sarah didn't have time for history. She dragged the cardboard box onto the high wooden counter, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Through the front window, she could see her car idling at the curb. Mia was in the passenger seat, wrapped in 2 blankets, her small face flushed and still. Every second Sarah stood here was a second her daughter sat in the cold. "I need to sell this," Sarah said, her voice tight. She didn't look at the man behind the counter. She was too busy pulling the flaps of the box open, her hands trembling. "I don't know what's in there. Just books, toys. I need $40, please. Just 40. $40 would buy antibiotics and a hot meal. That was the extent of her horizon right now. The man behind the counter, Mr. Jacobs, was a fixture of the neighborhood that Sarah had passed 1,000 times but never noticed. He was a man composed of sharp angles and gray stubble, wearing a thick wool cardigan that had seen better decades. He looked up from a pocket watch he was disassembling, his eyes magnified behind thick bifocals. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply looked at Sarah, then at the frantic energy radiating off her, and finally, at the soggy cardboard box. "We're not a charity, miss," he said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "And I don't buy yard sale leftovers." "It's not leftovers," Sarah snapped, the desperation sharpening into something jagged. "It was my husband's. He kept it in storage. Please, just look." Jacob sighed, a sound of professional weariness. He set down his tweezers and pulled the box closer. He reached in with a callous hand, grabbing the first comic book from the stack Sarah had haphazardly thrown together. It was the copy of the Amazing Spider-Man she had almost torn apart the night before. Sarah watched his face, waiting for the dismissal. She waited for him to toss it back, to tell her to take her trash and leave. She was already calculating if she could sell her wedding ring next. But Jacobs didn't toss it. He froze. The movement was subtle, barely a twitch, but the air in the shop seemed to shift. He adjusted his glasses. He reached under the counter and produced a pair of white cotton gloves, pulling them on with a sudden, reverent slowness. Sarah blinked. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He picked up the comic book again, handling it as if it were made of spun glass. He turned it over, examining the spine, checking the corners. Then he picked up a plastic-wrapped action figure, a small, unpainted soldier that looked unfinished. He brought a jeweler's loupe to his eye and leaned in close, inspecting the stamp on the figure's foot. When he finally looked up, the weariness was gone from his face. In its place was something intense, something that looked almost like fear. "Lock the door," he said. Sarah took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What?" "No. I have my daughter in the car. I just want the $40. If you don't want it, I'll go." "I said lock the door," Jacobs repeated, but his voice had softened. It wasn't a threat. It was in command of urgency. He bypassed the counter, moving faster than an old man should, and flipped the lock on the front entrance himself. He turned the sign to closed and pulled the blinds down. Sarah's instinct was to run. She looked at the door, then at Jacobs, her hand diving into her pocket for her keys as a weapon. "You asked for $40, Jacobs said, walking back to the counter. He looked at the box, then at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Tell me the truth. Where did you get this box? And don't lie to me, or I call the police right now." "I told you," Sarah cried, tears stinging her eyes. "It's my husband's. Mark Harrison. He died 3 days ago. His family kicked us out. This is all he left me. It's from a storage unit down the road." Jacob studied her face, searching for the lie. He saw the dark circles, the frayed cuffs of her coat, the raw, undeniable grief. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping. "Mark Harrison," Jacobs murmured. "The quiet guy. Came in here looking for protective Mylar sleeves a few years back." He looked down at the comic book in his gloved hands. "Miss, this isn't trash. This is an original 1963 print. The corners are sharp. The color saturation is near perfect." He pointed to the unpainted toy. "And this? This is a prototype mold from the Kenner factory, never released to the public. There are maybe 5 of these in existence." Sarah stared at him, the words floating in the air, refusing to land. "I don't understand. Is it worth $50? Jacobs looked at her with a mixture of pity and disbelief. He opened the cash register. It was empty of large bills. He went to a wall safe behind him, spun the dial, and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed the envelope on the counter. "I can't buy this whole box from you today," Jacobs said, his voice low. "I don't have that kind of capital on hand. Nobody in this town does. This needs an auction house. It needs authentication." He pushed the envelope toward her. "But this is $2,000, he said. "Consider it a down payment on just the toy. Leave the box here. I have a safe. It will be secure." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. $2,000. "For the toy," Jacobs corrected firmly. "The rest of the box, and whatever else is in that unit. Miss, if the condition is consistent, you're not looking at rent money. You're looking at a house. You're looking at college tuition." Sarah looked at the envelope. Then she looked out the window, through the slats of the blinds, at the silhouette of Mia's head in the car. The snow was falling harder now, burying the world in white silence. Mark hadn't been a failure. He hadn't been careless. He had been building a lifeboat piece by piece, paper by paper. hiding it in the one place his status-obsessed family would never look, in the things they considered garbage. She reached out and took the envelope. It felt heavy. It felt like heat. "Why?" she whispered, looking at Jacobs. "You could have given me $40. I wouldn't have known." Jacobs took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked old again, but his eyes were kind. "Because it's Christmas," he said simply. "And because I hate thieves. If I cheated you, I'd be no better than the people who put you in this position." He grabbed a pen and a notepad. "Go. Take your daughter to a doctor. Get a hotel room, a good one. Come back tomorrow at 10. We have a lot of work to do." Sarah walked out of the shop, the bell chiming behind her. The wind hit her face, biting and cruel. But for the first time in 3 days, she didn't feel the cold. She felt the envelope burning against her chest, a fire that Mark had lit for her from beyond the grave. She got into the car and slammed the door. "Mommy?" Mia mumbled, eyes half open. "Did you get the treasure?" Sarah started the engine. It roared to life, sounding stronger than before. She looked at her daughter, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Yes, baby," Sarah said. "Daddy left us the treasure. We're going to be okay." The first night in the hotel was not about celebration. It was about the simple, overwhelming miracle of heat. Sarah sat on the edge of the queen-sized bed, watching Mia sleep. The child was buried under a mountain of crisp, white duvet, her breathing deep and rhythmic, the fever finally breaking under the influence of antibiotics and a warm room. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the snow bury the city, clutching the envelope of cash against her chest. She wasn't just guarding the money. She was guarding the second chance it represented. The following months did not happen in a flash of cinematic glory. There were no shopping sprees or limousines. Instead, there was a quiet, methodical grind, orchestrated in the back room of Jacob's antique shop. They developed a routine. Every Tuesday, Sarah would bring a small, unassuming tote bag to the shop. Inside might be a pristine set of 1980s trading cards or a sealed video game cartridge from a forgotten console. Jacobs, with his jeweler's loupe and his Rolodex of private collectors, would work his magic. "Patience, Sarah," Jacobs would say, pouring tea from a chipped porcelain pot. "If we flood the market, the value drops. We are ghosts. We move silently." So they did. January bled into February, the slush turning to gray rain. While the rest of the town complained about the weather, Sarah was building a fortress. The money trickled in. 3,000 here, 5,000 there. It went straight into a new bank account at a different branch, one the Harrisons knew nothing about. Sarah found her anchor on the edge of the historic district, a dilapidated bakery that had been boarded up for 2 years. The windows were cracked, and the brickwork was crumbling. But when Sarah walked inside, she didn't smell rot. She smelled potential. She smelled yeast and vanilla and the ghost of mornings past. It reminded her of the storage unit, something the world had discarded, waiting for someone to see its worth. She bought the lease with cash. By spring, Sarah was no longer the frightened widow in the oversized coat. She was tired, yes, aching from scraping floors and painting walls until 2 a.m. But her eyes had changed. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a steeliness that surprised even her. She named the place the Second Story. It wasn't just a bakery. It was a living museum of nostalgia. Sarah used the less valuable items from Mark's collection to decorate. Old tin lunchboxes lined the shelves above the espresso machine. Vintage cereal boxes framed in glass hung on the walls. The tables were decoupaged with pages from damaged comic books. The shop became a sensation, not because of the coffee, but because of the feeling. In a world that felt increasingly cold and digital, walking into Sarah's shop felt like stepping into a warm memory. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the Harrison empire was beginning to show hairline fractures. Derek sat in his corner office, the view of the skyline obscured by the relentless spring rain. The expensive leather chair no longer felt like a throne. It felt like a cage. He stared at the spreadsheets on his monitor, the numbers bleeding red. The real estate market had cooled. The loans they had taken out to cover Mark's debts, a lie they told themselves to justify seizing the assets, were ballooning. "We need liquidity," Eleanor said, pacing the plush carpet of the office. She looked older than she had at the funeral. The grief she faked back then was beginning to look like real stress now. "The investors are asking questions about the development project. If we don't break ground by July, the bank calls the note." "I'm handling it, Mother," Derek snapped, rubbing his temples. He poured himself a drink, though it was barely noon. "It's just a cash flow problem. Temporary." He walked to the window, looking down at the street. He felt a creeping sensation of dread, a feeling that he had overlooked something vital. He thought about his sister-in-law, the mousy waitress he had kicked out into the snow. He assumed she was long gone, probably living in a trailer park 2 states over. He never gave her a second thought, except to laugh about the rust bucket van and the box of trash. "Focus, Derek," Eleanor commanded. "We need to cut the dead weight, sell the lake house, and see if we can refinance the main estate." Derek nodded, swallowing the burn of the whiskey. They were the masters of the universe. They always landed on their feet. Summer turned to autumn, and the leaves in Oak Creek caught fire with color. The second story was thriving. There was a line out the door every Saturday morning. Mia, now 7, sat at a corner table after school, doing her homework and drawing pictures of superheroes for the customers. Sarah stood behind the counter, wiping down the gleaming espresso machine. She wore a simple apron, her hair tied back. She looked out at the street, watching the leaves fall. She had seen the newspaper headlines. Harrison Development stalled. Local real estate magnate sued for breach of contract. She didn't gloat. She didn't post vague, triumphant status updates on social media. She simply went back to kneading the dough, the rhythmic motion, meditative and grounding. She was playing the long game. Jacobs came in one afternoon in November, shaking the rain from his umbrella. He sat at the counter, and Sarah slid him a fresh cinnamon roll without asking. "The auction for the centerpiece," Jacobs said quietly, leaning in. "The Action Comics #1. It closed an hour ago in Tokyo." Sarah paused, her hand hovering over the register. This was the crown jewel of Mark's collection, the one item Jacobs had kept in a bank vault until the market was perfectly primed. "And?" Sarah asked. Jacobs smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. He slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. It was a deposit slip. The number on it had 6 zeros. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," he whispered. Sarah looked at the number. It was enough to buy the Harrisons' house 3 times over. It was enough to ensure Mia would never, ever know the cold again. She folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just nodded, a calm, terrifying peace settling over her. "The snow is coming early this year," she said, looking out the window at the gray sky. "I have a feeling we're going to have some visitors soon." The stage was set. The storm was returning. But this time, Sarah wasn't the one without shelter. Christmas Eve returned to Oak Creek, but the world inside the windows of the second story bore no resemblance to the cold, sterile lawyer's office of the year before. Here, the air was heavy and sweet, thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, melted chocolate, and the sharp, clean aroma of pine. The bakery was closing for the holiday. Sarah wiped down the mahogany counter, the wood warm under her palms. The space was golden, lit by strings of amber fairy lights that reflected off the glass display cases. Most of the customers had gone home to their families, leaving only the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the soft jazz playing over the speakers. Mia, now a head taller and missing a front tooth, was by the window, arranging a basket of leftover baguettes and pastries. She pinned a handwritten sign to the basket, "Free for anyone who needs warmth." "That looks perfect, honey," Sarah said, untying her apron. "Let's pack up. We have a turkey to put in the oven at home." The bell above the door chimed. Not a gentle tintinnabulation, but a harsh jangle as the door was shoved open by the wind and a desperate hand. A gust of freezing air swept through the shop, carrying snow and the smell of exhaust. Sarah looked up, instinctively reaching for the towel to block the draft. 3 figures stood in the entryway, huddled together like wet birds. For a moment, Sarah didn't recognize them. The woman was stooped, clutching a coat that looked expensive but was stained with mud at the hem. The younger man was thin, his face gaunt, his eyes darting around the shop with the feral intensity of someone who hadn't slept in days. The older man, Mark's father, wasn't even there. The absence spoke volumes. "We saw the sign," the young man said, his voice raspy. He didn't make eye contact. He was staring at the basket of bread Mia was holding. "The sign says free." Sarah froze. Her heart hammered a single, hard rhythm against her ribs. It was Derek and Eleanor. They looked like ghosts of the people who had sat across the desk and sentenced her to homelessness. The arrogance was gone, eroded by the brutal friction of bankruptcy. The scandal had been thorough. The papers said the bank had seized everything: the cars, the lake house, the main estate. Sarah stepped out from behind the counter. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, illuminated by the golden light of the shop she had built. Derek's eyes traveled from the bread basket up to the person guarding it. He blinked, squinting against the warmth. Then his jaw went slack. "Sarah?" Eleanor looked up, her eyes clouded and dull. Recognition took longer for her, filtering through layers of shock. "Sarah?" "Hello, Derek." "Eleanor," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. There was no tremble, no fear. Just a calm, flat observation. Derek looked around the shop, his brain struggling to reconcile the data. He looked at the polished floors, the line of high-end espresso machines, the crowd of happy patrons visible in the framed photos on the wall. Then, his gaze landed on the wall behind the register. Framed in UV protective glass, centered like a religious icon, was the cover of the vintage comic book Sarah had almost destroyed that first night. Below it, on a small shelf, sat the rusted tin robot that had started it all. Derek took a step back, his face twisting. That's Mark's. That was in the unit." "Yes," Sarah said. A flush of color returned to Derek's pale cheeks. Not health, but rage. The entitlement, dormant but not dead, flared up. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You knew. You stole it. That unit was full of trash. You swindled us." "I stole nothing," Sarah replied, her voice dropping an octave, commanding the silence of the room. Mia moved behind her mother's leg, watching wide-eyed. "You told me it was worthless," Derek shouted, his voice cracking. You laughed when you gave me the keys. You said it was a severance package of junk. I didn't say that, Derek. You did. Sarah corrected him gently. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out the heavy, jagged ring of rusted keys. She kept them on her at all times, a talisman against complacency. She placed them on the glass counter. They made a heavy, dull thud. You held the keys to a fortune in your hand, Sarah said, looking him dead in the eye. Mark tried to tell you for years. He tried to show you his hobbies, his passions. But you called it childish. You called it garbage. You never looked inside the boxes because you were too busy looking down on the man who owned them. Eleanor let out a small, strangled sob. She leaned against the doorframe, looking at the warm pastries, the golden light, the life she had thrown away. It wasn't the metal that was valuable, Derek, Sarah continued, her gaze shifting to the framed comic. It was the knowledge. It was the care. Mark left me a future because he knew I would respect the past. You just wanted the quick cash of a liquidation sale. Derek opened his mouth to argue, to threaten a lawsuit, to scream. But he looked around the shop again. He saw the security cameras. He saw the way Sarah stood, not as a victim, but as a pillar. He realized, with a crushing finality, that he had no power here. He was just a man in a dirty coat on Christmas Eve, standing in the empire of the woman he had tried to destroy. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Sarah looked at them. She saw the hunger in Eleanor's eyes. She saw the defeat in Derek's shoulders. She could have called the police. She could have humiliated them, thrown them back into the storm with a lecture on karma. It would have felt good for a moment. But Sarah looked down at Mia. Her daughter was watching, learning what it meant to be strong. Sarah sighed, releasing the breath she felt she had been holding for a year. She picked up a large, white bakery box. She moved with efficient grace, using tongs to fill it. Thick slices of cranberry walnut bread, ham and cheese croissants, heavy chocolate muffins. She packed it full, until the lid barely closed. She walked around the counter and held the box out to Derek. "I can't give you the past back," Sarah said softly, "and I won't give you a penny of the future. But it is Christmas, and in this house we don't let people go hungry." Derek stared at the box. His pride warred with his stomach. His stomach won. He took the box, his hands shaking violently. "Go," Sarah said. It wasn't a suggestion. Derek turned, unable to look at her. He grabbed his mother's arm, and they stumbled back out into the night. The door swung shut, the bell chiming one last time, cutting off the howl of the wind. Sarah locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. She turned back to the empty shop. It was quiet. It was warm. "Mommy?" Mia asked, tugging on her hand. "Why did you give the bad man our bread?" Sarah picked her daughter up, hugging her tight, smelling the shampoo in her hair and the cinnamon on her clothes. She looked at the window, where the snow was burying the footprints of the people who had once owned her life. "Because, baby," Sarah whispered, kissing her forehead. "We have enough. And ghosts get hungry too." She turned off the main lights, leaving only the glow of the Christmas tree in the corner. "Come on," Sarah said. "Let's go home." The drive home was quiet. It wasn't the terrified silence of the year before, when every rattle of the engine sounded like a death knell. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of safety. The heater in Sarah's new SUV hummed a steady, reassuring note, keeping the storm at bay behind thick, insulated glass. Mia was asleep before they even left the parking lot of the bakery. She clutched a new plush reindeer to her chest, her breathing even and deep, unbothered by the wind that whipped the snow across the highway. She didn't dream of cold metal boxes anymore. She dreamed of sugar plums and school recess and a mother who smiled more than she cried. Sarah took the long way. She drove past the old cemetery, where Mark was buried. The gates were closed for the night, locked against the drifts. But she slowed down as she passed the stone pillars. "We did it, Mark," she whispered to the windshield, her voice barely audible over the tires crunching on the snow. "You knew. You knew exactly who they were, and you knew exactly who I could be." She didn't feel anger toward the Harrisons anymore. As she watched the city lights blur past, she realized that hate was too heavy a burden to carry when you were busy building a life. They were just footnotes now, cautionary tales wandering in the cold, while she had become the author of her own story. Their new house was a sturdy, two-story craftsman on a street lined with old oak trees. It wasn't a mansion. Sarah had no desire for the hollow echoes of a place like the Harrison estate. It was a home. It had a porch swing, a fireplace that actually worked, and a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and coffee even when nothing was baking. Sarah carried Mia upstairs, tucking her into a bed with flannel sheets that smelled of lavender detergent. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time, brushing a stray hair from her daughter's forehead. "Mommy?" Mia murmured, half awake, her eyes fluttering open. "I'm here, baby." "Did Santa come yet?" Sarah smiled, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Not yet. But the chimney's clear. He won't miss us this time." Mia drifted back to sleep with a smile on her face. Downstairs, the house was still. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the oversized armchair by the fireplace. The flames danced behind the iron grate, casting long, flickering shadows on the rug. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the keys. The rust had mostly rubbed off over the last year, worn away by the friction of her thumb, leaving the metal underneath smooth and dark. They were ugly keys. They were jagged and old and ordinary. To anyone else, they looked like something you would find in a junk drawer and throw away without a second thought. But as Sarah held them up to the firelight, she didn't see junk. She saw the bridge that had carried her over the abyss. She saw the test that Mark had left behind, a test of character that required patience to solve. The Harrisons had looked at the surface and seen trash. Sarah had looked deeper and found a future. She stood up and walked to the mantel. There, nestled between a framed photo of Mark and a vase of fresh holly, was a small velvet box. She opened it, not to take something out, but to put something in. She placed the rusted keys inside the velvet box, right next to her diamond wedding band. They belonged together. The ring was the promise of love. The keys were the proof of it. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the front yard. The snow was falling softly now, covering the world in a clean, white blanket. It was the same snow that had nearly killed them a year ago. But tonight, it just looked beautiful. It looked like peace. She took a sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. The storm could rage all it wanted. The wind could howl, the wolves could circle. It didn't matter anymore. They were warm. They were home. And they were made of gold. Most people spend their lives chasing the shiny things. They fight for the titles, the big houses, the appearance of power. But the truth is, the greatest inheritance isn't what you hold in your hand. It's what you carry in your heart when your hands are empty. Because sometimes, the most valuable things in life come wrapped in rust. You just have to be willing to do the work to find the shine underneath. Sarah proved that the best revenge isn't hatred. It's simply living a good life. But I have to ask you, if you were standing behind that counter on Christmas Eve, would you have shared your bread with the family that threw you out into the cold? Or would you have let them walk back into the storm? I'd love to read your honest thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. We have another powerful story waiting for you right here, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.